Greetings, CHP listeners and everyone else kicking the tires of this podcast show. Laszlo Montgomery here with a special episode to brighten your day. About a year ago, I had the chance to meet LA-based writer, producer, film director, and activist Curtis Chin. And he told me about this book coming out about his life growing up in a Chinese-American family who, 100 years ago, left Hoi San and made it to these shores with all its amber waves of grain and streets paved with gold. And what immediately interested me about Curtis's story was that his family, his ancestors, well, they didn't go to the obvious locations, San Francisco, New York, LA, or Chicago. They went to Detroit. Okay, now we're going to get to some of the other projects Curtis is involved in, but right now, I'd like to introduce Curtis Chin, author of the new book, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. Welcome to the CHP, Mr. Curtis Chin.
Thanks, Laszlo.
All the way from the other side of town.
Downtown LA. Yeah, thank you so much. And it was a pleasure meeting you a year ago. And I've been looking forward to this because I love your podcast. So,
So it's been about a year, hasn't it been? Yes, it's been about a year since we met for lunch in the San Gabriel Valley somewhere, me, you, and Jeff, and I got to know a little bit about you. And you were still finishing up your book or hadn't brought it to Little Brown. I forgot, but I told you, when it comes out, let me know. How can I resist a story like yours? So, can you give me the ancient history about how the Chins made it to Detroit? This was still back in the Qing Dynasty or early Republican period.
Well, first I should clarify that the book actually comes out October 17th. So we have a little bit of time, before. But people can pre-order it now through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or whatever. But the book starts off exactly with my family's history. The first line is, about my dad in the restaurant saying, "For here to go." And that's the theme of the whole book is like, do I stay or do I leave and find better pastures? And it's the same question that my great-great-grandfather asked of himself in China, because, at that time, they were poor. There wasn't much going on in their province. There was the Opium War that had just happened, but also drought and famine. And he had a small young family, and he decided to leave for America. I should clarify, though, that he actually didn't start off by going to Detroit. He actually went to Canton, Ohio, from Canton, China, thinking that there'd be Chinese people there. But when he didn't find any, that's when he moved up to Detroit. So it was still the Midwest.
See, the Football Hall of Fame wasn't even there yet.
The Football Hall of Fame wasn't there. But interestingly, the person that founded the city of Canton, Ohio, actually did business in China. And because of that, he named the city in honor of what China was, or Guangdong was called back then. And so
it's interesting.
My ancestors just thought there must be Chinese people there. I mean, they do Chinese business. So, but alas, there weren't many, so they trekked up to Detroit, which at the time was, even before the auto industry was just kicking off at that point. I like to say that my family arrived in Detroit even before there was a Ford Motor Company, even before there was Motown music. I mean, it had recently just, become it still had a strong French root at that time. I mean, I just can't imagine what Detroit was like back then. I mean, it's really, really crazy. But, they found their way. I mean, they did what a lot of immigrants did early on. My great-great-grandfather couldn't get a job working in the auto industry because he didn't really speak English. He was able to find domestic work, eventually opening a laundry and then a grocery store and then the restaurant. The first restaurant he opened was in 1939. Then he opened up a second one in 1940, which is the one that I grew up in, which is the more successful restaurant. So that's in a nutshell, my family's history of how they ended up in Detroit.
So how did the Chung's name come about? What was its earliest history before your father inherited it?
So my family name is actually Chin. So my great-great-grandfather is last name Chin. But his son-in-law, who he opened up the restaurant with, was named Chung. And so we took his name partly because he was, he spoke more English. He was more, good at that salesman type stuff. But interestingly, I say this in the book, is that Chung was actually his paper son name, which I'm sure you guys, have talked about on your podcast. But, his actual real name, his birth name is Yi. So the restaurant that I grew up in, Chung's, really was not named after any of us. there.
Interesting. What part of downtown Detroit was Chung's located in? Was that Cass and Peterborough? Was that?
Oh, yeah, because you have some familiarity with Detroit, right? Because you used to go there.
Yeah, I'd land at Detroit Metro, hop on the 94 West, and head straight to Dexter. That was my extent of Detroit.
Well, there used to be an old Chinatown that was closer to Corktown, which is the old Irish neighborhood. But when the city built a freeway back in the late 50s, early 60s, to sort of connect the white-collar workers who were moving into the suburbs or abandoning the city, they decided to destroy Chinatown and build the freeway over it. And so my family at that time had to decide whether or not they were going to move to the suburbs, like a lot of the Chinese restaurants did. They scattered, right? But because my family had one of the most popular restaurants, and we ran the main grocery store in Chinatown, they decided to stay in the city because there were some people who just couldn't make that jump to the suburbs. Oftentimes it was the old bachelors, who didn't have any resources to move out to the suburbs, or the newer immigrants. And so my family decided to stay in Detroit with their businesses, and they moved several blocks over to what was called the Cass Corridor, which was also nicknamed Little Kentucky because that neighborhood actually was a lot of white Appalachian, hillbillies there. And so I jokingly say in the book that it was reuniting the hillbillies, the Chinese hillbillies and the white hillbillies together. And so I think when they first moved down there, the neighborhood was more working class, and it was a predominantly white neighborhood in the inner city. But because it was not too far from the new center area where Wayne State University is, you also had a lot of artists and, people like that living in the neighborhood. But, as Detroit continued to face difficulties throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it just became tougher to sustain in that neighborhood.
You're familiar with both of them, but how would you compare Detroit's Chinatown with, old LA Chinatown?
Well, interestingly, like most Chinatowns, it also got displaced. So that the people who go to the LA Chinatown now, that's actually not the original Chinatown. The original Chinatown is where Union Station is. And so I think it's a similar in that sense, is that this relocation and trying to retrace that history. LA was a little bit different because, LA, they had these developers who actually reached out to the Hollywood studios and got set designers to design Chinatown. So there
were a lot of old films that were filmed in Chinatown, doubled for the real thing.
I mean, in some ways, it is like a set, right? Like because they brought in these set designers to design LA's Chinatown. Detroit didn't have that, and so the Detroit Chinatown, the one that I grew up in, which was called New Chinatown. And actually was developed as an international district. The original goal in the 60s when the city relocated to this neighborhood was to have all the different Asian groups. And so when I grew up in that Chinatown, it was ethnically more diverse. There were, predominantly Chinese, but also good numbers of Filipino, Indian, Afghani. So it was a pretty mixed international district, even though it was called New Chinatown. But even with everybody all pulled together, it still was never very large. I think there was maybe 6 Chinese restaurants and 1 Indian restaurant at its peak.
How big was it? Was it like 1 block, 2 blocks long?
Well, it was primarily centered on the corner of Cass and Peterborough, but it extended 1 block in each direction. But it was never very thick. To me, it felt cozy. It felt like this was our area. And it's not like my parents liked us walking beyond, 1 block away anyway. So as a young kid, it did feel like a enclosed area, an enclosed neighborhood.
So let's talk about Chung's. Tell me about Chung's signature dish. What the duckling Frederic Dallaire was to La Tour d'Argent in Paris. ABC or Wassoy guy. That was Chung's answer.
Yeah.
How did almond boneless chicken become a Chung's institution?
Well, so people who are from the Midwest, particularly Detroit or Ohio, will know about this dish called wasu gai. You can actually even find it in some of the really old chop suey joints on the coast, whether New York, LA, San Francisco. I was actually in Seattle a couple weeks ago, and there was a restaurant, the one that Bruce Lee hung out in. I went to that restaurant to hang out, and they actually had Wassu Gai on the menu, so I ordered it. So some restaurants will call it almond boneless chicken, but just be careful because some restaurants will have a dish called almond chicken, but it's not the same thing. So what almond boneless chicken is, and this belies Detroit's southern roots, right? Because it's very southern, is that it's basically a fried fillet of chicken smothered in gravy, brown gravy, and a little garnish on top, which was in our restaurant, it was like slivers of pea pod, water chestnut, and crushed almonds. But that was by far our best-selling dish. It's a very simple dish, and you'd eat it with a bowl of white rice. But we had people who'd come in every week for the same dish and get the special. I mean, it was just incredible.
Have you ever had the ABC in LA? How did it stack up against the Chung's version?
Well, I ordered it once at one place, but they made it differently. They made it with I don't know how they prepared it. It was like a stir fry instead, so it wasn't breaded. And it also had like celery chops and stuff like that. So I don't think I found our version of almond boneless chicken here in Los Angeles. But like I said, I just had it in Seattle. I've had it at an old place in San Francisco. You have to go to the really old chop suey joint type places, the places that have egg foo young, chop suey and stuff like that. They might actually have it on the coast. But in Detroit, every restaurant has it. And if you Google it, you'll find articles which talks about Detroit and its history with, the almond boneless chicken, which is also another interesting thing. It's just the regionalism. We think about the regionalism of Chinese food in China, but in America too, there's a lot of regionalism with Chinese American cooking as well. I mean, a lot of it's access to what ingredients you can get. And as a side note, there is a debate as to where the almond boneless chicken originated. Some people say Ohio, some people say Detroit. My grandmother actually says that we invented it, our restaurant. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if there's any written record of that, but she, went to her grave thinking that we were the ones that invented it.
So Chung's was open to everyone, no segregation. Can you talk about who were your bread and butter Chung's customers and who they were?
You cannot talk about a restaurant without talking about the city that it's based in, right? Because so much of a restaurant's character is defined by the city itself, right? Detroit, I would say, it's location. Detroit was a racially divided city, where you had white collar, oftentimes white workers during the daytime, but at 6 p.m. they would all clear out to the suburbs, right, leaving a more diverse clientele of more people of color. And that was sort of how our restaurant was. So I really saw the microcosm, the whole gamut of Detroit society there. The celebrities during the day, the Mayor Coleman Young was but then at night, again, the people that were more on the fringes of society. One of the things that I like to talk about is, because people always ask me, so your book is titled Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. So what did you learn in a Chinese restaurant? And the one thing that I always say is the first lesson I learned is as a young kid, most parents always advise their kids not to talk to strangers, right? Don't talk to strangers. But my parents actually had the opposite thought because my mom didn't graduate high school. My dad went to community college for a couple semesters. So they didn't have a lot of educational background, but they knew that our dining room was full of people who had this experience, these ideas of different jobs, of the potential out there. And my parents really wanted to expose us to that. So whenever anybody came in and my dad found out they had an interesting job, my parents would grab us and pull us over and say, hey, talk to these people. Find out what it means to be, working in a factory. Find out what it means to be, an anchor of a TV station. Find out what it means to be a lawyer. Things that they would have no idea how do you get there. But they knew that in that dining room, that the whole world was available to us, and they made sure we took advantage of it. And I just thank my parents so much for having that attitude of wanting to expand our opportunities beyond the restaurant. So I just can't thank them enough.
Yeah, I know. You make that clear in your book. I was so interested in your yin, your nai. She gave you a rough time as a kid. A Jewish bubby got nothing on her. Why do you think she was so mean? Was she just doing her job or just keeping everyone in line?
Well, her opening line in the book is "mo yong," meaning useless. Yeah, she always called us useless. I try to be. I don't know how you read my grandmother in the book, or if you feel like I come to some resolution. I don't want to spoil the book either. Hopefully, people will follow me along on that journey with my grandmother. But in terms of her unhappiness, I think I have to think back on it to. She came to this country herself, right? Not speaking any English, not knowing anyone. She's very, very poor. And she probably didn't have very many opportunities in her own life. And so maybe that probably led to why she was so unhappy. Or maybe we were just bad kids. I don't know. I don't know. But she certainly didn't like us running around and, having fun and laughing and enjoying ourselves. And I think some of it stemmed from her dislike for my mom, because though my parents had an arranged marriage, the person that she tried to set up my dad with, when my dad went to Hong Kong for the first time, because my dad was born in America, he went to Hong Kong to meet the woman that my grandmother was trying to set him up with. But she already had a secret boyfriend, so my dad had to find my mom on his own. And because my grandmother never had a say in who my dad got to marry, I think that was part of it. And it was just, I don't even put in the worst parts in the book, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's all right. I think we got an idea. She was quite a character and a product of her times and her circumstances.
Can I share a story with you, though?
Yeah.
A recent thing. So I was in Austin, Texas, about a month ago now, and I was staring at an Airbnb, and I was about to meet my friends for lunch, and they called me and said, "Hey, we arrived at the restaurant early. Can you meet us early?" And I said, "Sure." So I called the Uber. I went downstairs to wait for them on the street corner, right? And there's this old Chinese lady who's just standing there stretching. And she looks back at my sweatshirt, and it said Detroit versus everybody, because I like to wear that shirt. And she asked me, "Oh, are you from Detroit?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I'm from Detroit too." And it turned out that she was friends with, her mom was best friends with my grandmother, and she was friends with my dad.
Oh, wow.
It is so strange. But the interesting thing is that she said she loved my grandmother, right? She said my grandmother was the nicest person. She taught her how to drink American coffee and all this great stuff. And she kept trying to convince me that my grandmother was a good person. And I'm kind of superstitious, like most Chinese people, and a thought crossed my mind that maybe it's my grandmother coming back from the grave to defend herself because the book is coming out. You know what I mean? And I said to this woman, because she was saying, like, you have it totally wrong about your grandmother and stuff like that. And I said to her, "No, I totally accept the fact that you like my grandmother and she was a good person to you, but that does not negate the fact that she was not a good person to me." Because people are like that, right? They can be good to one person and not good to another. And I'm not challenging your impression of her, your memories of her. And I'm not going to try to convince you of your memories of her. You should retain those good memories of her. I just don't have good memories of her. And we should just leave it at that. And so, but I just felt like, and I thought about it afterwards, I was like, yeah, this is definitely a sign that my grandmother's coming back and saying, this is my side of the story. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Anyway.
So let me ask you something. Since you grew up in that restaurant, did the local Jews actually show up on Christmas, or is that an urban legend? I don't ever remember doing that.
Yeah, no, they did. We have a very strong relationship with our customers of the Jewish faith, and it's throughout the whole book. Our relationship throughout, and it starts off even from the beginning of the book, is that, as I meant to you, the city was destroying the old Chinatown, and my family was deciding what to do. So they kept the businesses in the city, but they decided to move their home because they were living above the restaurant, right? But they decided to move. They were living above the grocery store, sorry. They decided to move out to the suburbs to get the better schools. And so they found a property just north of 8 Mile, because that's the dividing line between the city and the suburbs, and it was still quick enough for them to get down to work. They found a piece of land, but the white owner would not sell to them. And so what my grandfather had to do was he had to ask one of his Jewish customers to buy the land for him and then sell it to him at cost. And, in exchange, he gave them free egg rolls for decades afterwards. So
rather than a few points, that's a good deal.
yeah, that's a good deal, I think. But yes, but that's just the start of a long history between the different communities. At least with ours, I don't know what to say, but throughout the book, you'll have constant references to that. And even now, as I'm promoting the book, one of the things I've been pitching to a lot of Jewish organizations is that for their Jewish Christmas, for your listeners who don't know what that is, it traditionally is Chinese food and a movie. I've suggested they instead do Chinese food and a book, and buy my book and do a book club, for Chinese for their Jewish Christmas this year. So,
well, it'll be out by then. So tell me about the cast party of The King and I. That was a great scene. Yul Brynner in your own restaurant.
So that's the magical thing about our restaurant is that, like I said, we had. I don't know how to politely describe it. I mean, like we had the pimps and prostitutes and drug dealers that came in, but we also had the celebrities that came in too. We really did see everybody. And when The King and I was coming to play at the Masonic Temple, which was the big theater in Detroit, they decided to book our restaurant, for their cast party. And my dad was so excited because, Yul Brynner's a big star, and it was a big thing for Detroit to get a big Broadway production because they never come to Detroit, right? And so my dad was so excited because he always felt like Chinese restaurants didn't get their due, their respect. And to have a big celebrity wanting to come to our restaurant made my dad so excited. And so he spent that, week or 2 weeks in advance just doing all the extras, cleaning up the place, getting extra things like ice cream. We never had ice cream in our restaurant, but he bought ice cream just in case, Yul Brynner wanted ice cream. And so, but sadly, unfortunately, Yul Brynner did not turn out to be the nicest customer. And so that was a lesson for us.
But you mentioned the immortal Coleman Young, the MF in charge. Did he come in often, or was that just like a one-time thing where you got to meet him?
Oh, no, he came in regularly. Yeah.
Oh, really?
He came in regularly. And he always had his bodyguards. I mean, he had his bodyguards that came in with him in the restaurant and the bodyguards that waited outside, And he always came in when he knew we'd be kind of empty, which is sort of like that afternoon hour. So, yeah, no, he was a regular customer.
Yeah, he was mayor for 20 years, from 1974 to 94. That was, I enjoyed having him around. He was quite a character. Great quotes.
You probably watched him on TV whenever you came to town, or you heard about, he's a lightning rod.
We watched him in Chicago. I was,
you did? Okay.
I wasn't too far away. But of course, we knew Coleman Young. So 1982, you just start in high school, and the killing of Vincent Chin took place. You produced a documentary called Vincent Who, and I covered his life in a previous CHP episode. You knew of Vincent, but he was much older than you. Did your parents know him, or his mother Lily? I remember when it happened and followed it quite closely, but, reading about it in L.A. wasn't the same as living through it in Detroit. Your family shared the same surname. So can you talk about that time 40 years ago?
Yeah, so for your listeners, a quick recap. This is the early 80s. Detroit was in the auto industry was, in the throes. It was like going downhill fast. There was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. Vincent was a Chinese American who was out celebrating his upcoming wedding the following week. At some point, two white auto workers come in and they're overheard saying, "It's because of you mother blanks that we're out of work." They get kicked out of the bar, but unfortunately, these guys get in their car and they drive around until they finally see Vincent sitting outside of McDonald's, and then they take a baseball bat and they bash his head in and kill him. And
right in front of a cop, too.
Right in front of a cop. And to make matters worse, the judge only fined them $3,000. They never served a single day in jail. And that was such a shocking death, but also verdict. I mean, in terms of what would happen, because I always thought that, if you kill someone, you go to prison, right? So it did challenge my understanding of justice in America. And yes, we did know the family. My uncle was his best man. There weren't a lot of Chins in Detroit. The primary surname in Detroit was actually Yi, so most people were Yis. So in terms of the family association, our Chin family association was very, very small. I mean, so we all knew each other and we were pretty tight.
How did Vincent's murder affect your family and the vibe in Chinatown and amongst the Chinese American community there?
Well, among the Chinatown, I mean, I'll have to be honest with you. I think initially a lot of the Chinatown community in some ways blamed the victim of saying like, well, why are you at a strip club? Sometimes people do that. I think that eventually, though, they understood, especially with the verdict afterwards, that this was a wrong miscarriage of justice, that it doesn't matter where you're going, whatever. So I think that they had to learn a little bit of, about understanding it too. But I think a lot, maybe some of it was shame or whatever. I don't know. I don't know if it's a cultural thing or whatever. When something bad happens, you sort of internalize it and blame yourself or you blame the victim. So it was a learning experience, definitely. For me, as a 14-year-old kid, just trying to figure out myself, it in some ways changed the trajectory of my life, because prior to that, I actually thought that I might just inherit the restaurant. I'd be a waiter for the rest of my life. I mean, it was a successful Chinese restaurant. I loved the Chinese food. I loved being around my family. That might have been a viable option for me in life. But then, when Vincent had been murdered, I really became a news junkie, wanting to find everything I could about the story, of seeing how things were presented. And sadly, there weren't a lot of articles about him, yet at the same time, there were lots of pieces being written about the auto industry, and in some ways having sympathy for these killers and saying, oh, you have to understand that our city's under attack, et cetera, et cetera. And so it made me wonder, like, well, who's going to tell Vincent's side of the story? Who's going to tell the Asian American side of the story? And so my first thing was I started writing letters to the editor, which is, the story with Mayor Coleman Young, is I started writing these letters to the editor, none of which ever got published because I'm 14 years old and not very good writer. But then when I was talking to Mayor Young one day in the restaurant dining room, he's like, son, you need to be more angry. And I'm like, we're Buddhists. We don't do anger. We're supposed to let go of this stuff. It's a journey about learning, and I'm still learning, right? How to find my place and how to find my voice in this country. When it comes to these issues of race relations.
So 2 years after Vincent's murder, spring of 1984, you turned 16. What was going on in your life and in the Chinese American community in Motown?
Well, okay, so a couple years happens. My initial response to the Vincent Chin murder was actually to because one of the questions affecting Asians in Detroit at that time was a question of loyalty, right? Like, do you side with the Japanese or the Asians? Or are you siding with the white Americans and stuff like that? And for me, to prove my loyalty, I decided to... what did they say? What's that term? When in Rome?
Do as the Romans.
Do as the Romans or whatever. Do as the Romans. So that's what I decided to do. I became at that time, what was a politically popular term was the Reagan Democrats, right? Because Reagan was coming about, and the Republican Party had just had their convention in Detroit. And so I became a Republican. And in my book, I like to say I was the Asian Alex P. Keaton. I was a terrible, 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 awful, awful person back then. I was class president of the NHS. I went to Boys State. I wrote conservative editorials for our high school paper. I tried to shut down the smoking lounge at school. I kicked people out of the NHS for not, pulling their weight.
Not a compassionate conservative?
I was not a very compassionate person, as they say. Well, that's the thing. The term hadn't been created yet. It came about a couple of years later, and that was part of my journey as to why I started to move away from that political party. Because, I totally loved the term compassionate conservatism, but when it came to the issue of AIDS, the party was not very compassionate at all, and it was actually quite judgmental towards people with that disease. And so, but that was my response. And in Detroit, in terms of what was happening in Detroit, it was actually the Devil's Night, which I don't know if your viewers know about it. You probably heard about it in Chicago, is when the city, the night before Halloween, the city would go up in flames. I mean, the worst year, I think, was 84, when over 800 homes and businesses were burnt that one single night. It was crazy. So I talk about that in the book. And the Tigers had won the World Series that year, too, and the city also was burning that time. It's like our city was constantly burning. And that is a theme of the book, is the city of Detroit constantly in crisis and having to navigate that. as I mentioned, I mean, 5 people get murdered by the time I'm 18. I can't even fit them all in the book. I think I only talk about 3 of them.
Yeah. How bad was the anti-Asian racism when you were growing up in Detroit? You've lived in New York, and now you're in L.A. Well, you've lived other places. Is it the same everywhere, or did Detroit have its own version?
Well, obviously, you have the versions where Vincent Chin is murdered, right?
Yeah.
But I think, like with most places, oftentimes it's what people call microaggressions. It's the small things, which sort of add up to in the book what I call like death by the Chinese paper cut. It's like death by 1,000 cuts. And that's the part that actually gets to you. It's in some ways it's kind of weird because like here in LA, I'll be walking down the street and people will yell anti-Asian things to me, particularly after COVID, right? Like cars would drive by and just shout anti-Asian things to me. Those kind of things I can handle. I can blow it off, right? It's the other type when people who are well-meaning accidentally say something which is a little insensitive that they hurt a little bit more, and those are the ones that are a little bit more difficult to deal with. But like I said, I do try to be compassionate with these things. I say in the book there's 2 types of racism. There's mean racism and dumb racism. I mean, all racism's dumb, but some of them are also mean. And like for me, the mean racism, which includes any phrase that says "you people," or go back to where you're coming from, that stuff I don't tolerate at all. But the other ones where it's just, just due to ignorance or just lack of exposure or whatever, those, I learn to accept and tolerate because I look at people's intention. If you don't have ill intention, then it's a possibility for a learning experience.
So high school was a rather transformational time for you, well, as it is for many people. This is where you discovered one of your passions, politics and journalism. So besides AIDS that was going on in the 80s, what issues back then really mattered to you?
Well, I was just on, like, Ronald Reagan's quote was "Make America Great Again," right? Waving the flag and stuff like that.
Was that him?
Yeah, no, that was his quote, actually.
Trump, tisk, tisk.
Well, that's the thing about Trump is that I don't think he's ever had an original thought in his head. Everything he says is borrowed from somebody else. So he took that from Reagan. Mm-hmm. And when Reagan said it in a much more positive way. Do you know what I mean? Like the way Trump says "Make America Great," I find it to be a little bitter, a little bit whatever. But Reagan wasn't like that. Reagan was just, obviously his version of "Making America Great" is different from what other people might say, but he really sold it as a positive, what was that?
I thought that was Bush 41, the shining light on the hill, 1,000 points of light.
Light on the hill, or I can't remember. Yeah, that might be Bush, but they come from the same model. Or that was the Republican playbook at that time. You know what I mean? After all the terribleness of the 70s, the Iran hostage crisis and all that stuff. And so I don't know if there was one issue per se, except just being positive about America. Saying nice things about America was important to me. I don't know if there was one particular issue. Although I did jokingly say that in the book, the moral decline of America was happening at that time, and I blame Madonna. And so I think there was a little bit of that going on.
So during that time, you started waiting tables at Chung. So all these years in the restaurant, you had never waited tables. Do you have any memorable stories of customers or generalizations you can make from that experience?
Well, like most restaurant kids, you actually start at the bottom, right? You are starting by like being the busboy, or just being the sous chef and helping your grandmother make those egg rolls. I mean, that's what you start off doing, right? Or just in some ways, just staying out of the adult's way. That's your first job. And then I slowly worked my way up, to dishwasher, and then to waiting tables, and then eventually the manager. I never got to cook because I was the worst cook. And I don't want to spoil too much about the book, but that's a theme in the book, is that everybody in my family could cook except for me. My grandmother had her pastries. My grandfather made, tofu and barbecue meats. Interestingly, my mom, who was born in China, made the best Western food. My dad, who was born in Detroit, made the best Chinese food, Hong Kong food. Right, in a cultural twist, right? And so even my siblings all cooked. Everybody cooked except for me. So I I did not start off as a very good cook. So there's a little journey about me, and understanding how to be a good cook in the book. But yeah, no, there are lots of memorable stuff. I don't want to spoil too much, Laszlo. So they got to read the book. But yes, it was an adventure meeting the people, who came through our doors. So, yes.
So off to the University of Michigan. That's where you went in. Not too far from home. Were you always home on the weekends, or how did that work? That's not too far. Ann Arbor is with less than an hour.
No, I will reveal a little bit. Is that at that time, I did not want to go to college. I actually, it was the time of AIDS, like you said, and there was another gruesome murder that happened during my senior year, which I talk about, is that the murder of Dr. Alan Canty. It's a pretty well-known murder. There's actually a book about it called Masquerade, out that James Woods actually wanted to make a movie out of. But so he was a regular customer, always came in, ate at odd hours, told us he was an ER doctor. Turned out he was actually a famous psychiatrist who was coming out to the area to hire the prostitutes because, everything's cheaper in Chinatown. And he ran up this really high bill with this one girl, wanted to break off. And the pimp got so upset that he killed him also with a baseball bat and then chopped up his body with a Ginsu knife and littered it all across the freeway up to northern Michigan. And I did not foresee myself having a long future, right? With all the death and mayhem in Detroit and with AIDS coming about, I really thought I had a short lifespan, and I didn't understand the value of staying in a school for 4 more years. And it was only after thinking about my parents' sacrifice, because my parents really, really wanted me to go to college. And I thought, well, how much is 4 years? For my parents who have sacrificed so much of their lives for their kids, how much is giving up 4 years? And so I did go off to the University of Michigan. And, in some ways, it definitely changed my life and the trajectory of my life, going to college. I don't regret it. I appreciate going. And, I won't get in too much details about the book, but that is part of the journey, my relationship. Because, again, the opening line of the book is "for here to go," right? That was how my dad greeted every customer, but it's also the same thing that I asked myself throughout my life: for here or go. Do I stay in Detroit? Do I stay with my family, this wonderful restaurant that I love with so many great memories? Or do I go off and be the person that I want to be, right? Pursue my own dreams and also come out of the closet. I mean, these are issues that I think most readers can hopefully sympathize with, whether you're Chinese American or Asian American or not. Every kid goes to that point where they have to ask themselves, right? How much do I stick with my family and how much do I move out onto my own?
How did San Francisco strike you? That was a really intense part of the book. You went and took a little trip to San Francisco, a gay person of color from a religious minority, and a Detroit working class background, and a Republican to boot. Did it appear at first like you were on another planet?
Yeah. Again, I don't want to get into the good, funny stories, but hopefully you found these stories funny and joyful. Yeah, hopefully, because it was a crazy childhood. I mean, it's just I just feel so blessed that I've had such an interesting life. You know what I mean? Isn't that the famous quote? May you live in interesting times. You know what I mean?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'd love to live in interesting times.
I definitely feel like I did. I mean, even the fact that I was on the Wheel of Fortune as a high schooler, but I couldn't even put that in the book. I just had so many fun, weird stories that happened to me. And yes, going off to San Francisco, for a little trip is part of that,
So during your college years, you switched teams from red to blue. You could have been one of the stars of the GOP one day.
Oh yeah, they like those people of color that are conservatives. They seem to elevate them.
Oh man, yeah. That's I didn't know about the model minority. I learned about that from reading your book, about the whole model minority thing. Yeah, I mean, of course, I knew that term, but I didn't know that was the New York Times.
Yeah.
And
okay.
What that. So and I liked your description of the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, as having different versions of its past and visions for its future. That was an interesting way to put it. So why did you change your political stripes?
Yeah, well, so first I should take a step back and say why I wrote the book. I was so dismayed that our country seems to be so divided. We live in different universes almost, like we don't talk to each other. And I do retain that as part of, my upbringing is that, I'm very pro-America. I want to see us all together. I want to figure out a way where we can all live side by side because I feel like we're a stronger country when we're all together, right? And I think that food and Chinese restaurants can help with that because it is one of those few places where you can walk in and see people from different backgrounds, right? Religious, racial, socioeconomic. You can see them all in a Chinese restaurant. And if I can do that, and bring people together because they want to read about a Chinese restaurant, but then also have serious discussions, and I feel like I've done my job. And as I pitch to my agents, it's like, come for the Chinese food, but stay for the talk on racism. Because, these are hard times. These are hard discussions to have. But it doesn't benefit anybody to not have these discussions. We've got to figure out a way to have these discussions, but also say in a way that brings us together and doesn't push us to our separate corners. And that's my small wish. Maybe it's not such a small wish, but maybe that's something that hopefully my book can at least lead us into this way. I know that there are some people who are just going to reject the book outright. Some people will embrace it automatically, and then there'll be this whole middle of people who will pick it up because they're intrigued by the title, and they'll wonder what it's about, and hopefully that will, get people to think a little bit differently. Yeah. But was that your question about politics? I sort of veered off, I think.
Yeah, that's basically it. I was just asking what led you to change teams, and
well, the three specific policy things were I call it in the book the three A's. The first was apartheid. I did not understand how Reagan could support that clearly racist policy to me. The second one was AIDS, which we talked about. At first, I was all supportive of the Republican policy, which was compassionate conservatism, right? Because as a Buddhist, we're taught compassion, right? It makes sense to me. But the way they talked about, these people who are dying or who had died was just not compassionate at all. They blamed them and said all these evil things, and it just didn't sit well with me. But it was actually the third A, which was abortion, which changed my mind ultimately because at the time I was anti-choice. I was pro-life because, as a closeted gay guy, I knew that I wasn't going to get a girl pregnant accidentally, right? So why should I care, right, what a woman has to do with their body? And it was only after I went off to college and I met a couple, my hallmates, these women who said no. They brought it down to a very simple level and said it's just about us controlling our bodies, deciding what we want to do. And it clicked to me that, well, that's exactly what I want to do too. I just want to control my own life. I want agency. I want to be able to decide what I want to do, right? And when I made that connection, then I switched my attitude about abortion because I didn't want to be a hypocrite, so that's how I sorely shifted over. And I was independent for a while. I didn't immediately switch over to Team Blue, and it was much later after I was an adult and started getting involved with some politics. And I think it was the Howard Dean campaign that got me to switch over. And then I got really active with both the Obama campaigns and then eventually the Biden-Harris campaign and various other campaigns too.
So while you were busy at Michigan, the old neighborhood in Detroit was really deteriorating. What was happening to the city, and how did it affect Chung's and your family back home? And what did the Cass corridor deteriorated to by the time the restaurant closed in 2000?
Well, again, I'm not going to spoil away the book, but yes, Detroit continued to have hard times. And again, it feeds into that whole theory. Do you stay or do you go? Because one of the lessons that my parents always taught me was loyalty. Be loyal to the people, right? And a lot of times they were talking about our customers. Be loyal to our customers. Our customers are loyal to us. Be good to them, right? But, sometimes when things are so bad, you have to cut your losses at some point. And that's as much as I'll say. At some point,
Yeah, to read about what Detroit used to be, and what it became. I mean, really, that is just one of the saddest stories in American history. But I don't know. I haven't been to Detroit in a while. Is it coming back? Is there some redevelopment? I mean,
Well, that's one of the things I say this in the book. It's really sad to grow up in a poor city, but it's even worse to grow up in one that was formerly rich, because we could see the past glory of Detroit. We could see the beautiful homes, which are just right around the block from where our restaurant was, and just to see those homes individually year after year after year deteriorating. It was just my whole childhood I could see literally burn down in front of me. And then when you had the murders and you add the crack and the AIDS, I sometimes am amazed that I actually got out with at least some sense of normalcy.
Yeah.
And again, I think I owe that all to my parents and the restaurant. That's why I will forever love Detroit. I will love my family. I will love the restaurant. I will love all of that. And I would not trade my childhood for anything.
So growing up in that restaurant and that environment, can you really say that everything you learned from that Chinese restaurant?
I think that I learned so much about myself and people and the basics of humanity that in some ways, I learned specific lessons, little tricks on how to be a good waiter or how to cook, like little bon mots, like I'd say making a soup, how the smallest ingredient, like salt or pepper, could have the biggest impact, right? Like there are little things that you learn, but at the basic level, you learn about the importance of family. Yeah. So I do think so. I do think that I learned more in that Chinese restaurant than any other space, education and stuff.
Well, I'm not gonna ask you to get into more details, because anybody who wants to know could read the book and they'll see all the lessons you learned throughout those years. So let's talk about some of the other things you're doing. You have a film out called Dear Corky that looks at the life of New York-based photographer Corky Lee. Can you tell me about that, as well as the workshop you co-founded for Asian American writers in New York?
Yeah, so obviously, with the Vincent Chin case is something that inspired me. I've always been connected to the Asian American community. I've been pretty successful in terms of straddling that line between doing some of these more community-oriented programs, but then also working for mainstream entertainment companies. And it's been a good life in that way. So I try to balance it. With the Corky Lee film that's coming out, that's been doing really, really well on the film festival circuit, and I can't reveal too much, but some major network has said they want to buy it. So I can't tell you who yet, because I haven't signed off on it yet. But
who was he?
So Corky Lee was this incredible photographer who had been photographing the Asian American community starting in the New York Chinatown since the late 60s. So he literally had been photographing the community for 60-odd years, and he has 6 figures worth of photographs. And if you talk to anybody that's involved in the Asian American community, everybody knows him and his work. And I would bet you that most of your viewers recognize his work. They just don't recognize that that's him. Anyway, I was making a documentary called Our Chinatown, which looked at Chinatowns around the United States. This is prior to COVID. We were looking at issues of gentrification and aging population, things like that. And we're about 80% done with filming. And then COVID hits. And so we had to shut down production. I wasn't sure what we were going to do with the footage, but I thought okay, this will be a few months and then we'll get back to, production again. But, these months lingered on, and then sadly, Corky caught the virus and died. And so I had all this footage I wasn't sure what to do with. And so I made a short out of it. So it's a 17-minute doc. If anybody wants to see it, feel free to email me at info@curtisfromdetroit.com, and I'll figure out a way to get you to see it. Because right now it's mostly film festivals and colleges where you can see it. And eventually it'll be up on Canopy, which is a streaming service. But it's a very touching portrait of the artist. And again, dealing with a lot of issues that I feel like I've also dealt with, which is, how do you document and empower our community through art? And at the same time, take care of yourself.
Any other new projects or collaborations coming up for you?
Well, the book is the big thing, because obviously it takes a lot to launch. So between now and June, in the next 2 months, I'm only at home in LA for about 3 or 4 days. Otherwise, I'm on the road at conferences, at libraries, places. Even just before the book comes out in October, I'm just starting to tell people about the book, trying to meet with book clubs, people that work at companies who have employee resource groups, law firms, anybody that has meetings that would love to have me come in and speak. I've been talking to them, and they've been pre-ordering the book. So that's primarily what I'm doing. In addition, writing-wise, I have a couple projects with PBS that I'm working with, and one with Warner Brothers. I can't get into details about those, but those are, again, the mainstream projects that I work on that allows me to do some of these other things. And I've also been doing some freelance writing. I think last year I wrote articles for Bon Appetit and CNN and a couple pieces for the Boston Globe. So I'd like to do a little bit more of that this coming year, particularly to help raise awareness about the book. But yeah, no, so I dabble in all kinds of different writing projects.
Great.
So.
Well, I just have to say, I really enjoyed the book, and I learned a lot from your fabulous narrative telling the story of your life. Learned a few new words, a few new terms, that's for sure. So places like Chung's, like you said, are as American as apple pie. And I thank you for bringing your story to me and allowing me to share it with my whole CHP community. And I know you're not going to be in town much, but we need to meet up again in SGV and do it one more time. I still have a bunch of other questions I want to ask you.
Well, that restaurant you picked for us was great. I had no idea when we went into it because it seemed like such a simple restaurant that it was actually a Michelin star restaurant. And we only saw that on the wall afterwards. I think you said it was your daughter's recommendation?
Yeah. They give Michelin stars to anybody these days.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Where do you go in LA to get the old style, traditional 1960s Cantonese food? It's like nobody does it anymore.
There's one place that I went to once that was in the fashion district over here, because that's where the old Chinatown was in Los Angeles, right? And I think, is the restaurant called Paul's or something? I have to look it up, but there is one of those old places left. But most of the ones in that did survive in the LA Chinatown have also upgraded their menu a bit or adapted a little bit. But yeah, so you don't always get everything, but it is hard. But one thing I did want to say is that for people that want to follow me, because the book is coming out in October, please come to my website at Curtis from Detroit. You'll see my tour schedule. I'm going to be up and down the East Coast, also in the Midwest and the West Coast. I'm going to hit probably like 30 to 50 places for my book tour. And it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm talking to some of the big libraries, some of the major bookstores in the U.S. It's beginning a great, phenomenal response where all these dream places where I was like, oh, that's the place I'd want to read. They're all saying yes.
Great.
Yeah, so hopefully it'll be a big, splashy book. So come to my website, Curtis from Detroit, and you can learn more about it. You can also see my Vincent Hu film for free up there because I put it up on free there. So if you want to watch that, you can do that.
Okay, so I'll have that link at the show notes. So once again, my thanks to Mr. Curtis Chin. The new book is called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, from the beautiful people at Little Brown, part of the venerable Hachette Group. So until we meet again, this is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the Southland. As always, do consider coming back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.